Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we share an inspiring journey of resilience, self-discovery, and the power of standing up against prejudice. This is the story of Alex, a bright Filipino student at Ridgeview High, who faced humiliation from a teacher in the classroom. But instead of giving in to despair, Alex's strength of character and dedication to his dreams led to an unexpected turning point. Join us as we dive into a tale that reminds us all that no matter the obstacles, true greatness comes from within. Subscribe to the channel to start today's story. Alex stood at the door of Ridgeview High's advanced physics classroom, his notebook gripped tightly in his hand. He wasn't just nervous because it was his first day at a new school, nor because this was a class filled with students who had been there far longer than he had. It was the weight of being different that hung heavily on his shoulders. As a Filipino student in a predominantly white school, he often felt like an outsider, an unfamiliar presence in an unfamiliar world. But Alex wasn't one to back down. His dream of becoming an engineer had always driven him to excel academically. This was his chance to prove himself. He adjusted his glasses nervously, taking a slow breath before stepping into the room. The students were already seated, talking among themselves. As Alex walked to an empty seat near the back, his heart pounded in his chest. He glanced around, hoping to go unnoticed, but the eyes of a few students lingered on him. Some curious, some judgmental. He didn't know it yet, but today would be the first of many challenges he would face, not just from the world outside, but from someone who was supposed to guide him. Mrs. Harrison, the teacher, stood at the front of the class with her arms crossed, a sharp gaze sweeping over the room. Her reputation had preceded her: strict, intimidating, and, to some, unapproachable. Alex had heard the rumors about her demanding nature, but he was determined to prove himself worthy of being in her class. However, something about Mrs. Harrison didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just her formidable presence. There was an undercurrent to her interactions with him, something that felt cold, dismissive, perhaps even prejudiced. He could feel it every time she spoke to him, her tone laced with subtle mockery. It had started the moment he entered the class, when Mrs. Harrison's eyes had flicked to him for a split second longer than necessary. He was used to being looked at like that, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with judgment, but today, the glance felt different. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just nerves. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Today we're discussing thermodynamics. Mrs. Harrison's voice rang out sharply, drawing Alex's focus. Before we dive in, can anyone explain the second law of thermodynamics in their own words? Alex raised his hand cautiously, his heart racing. Thermodynamics had always been his favorite subject. He had spent countless hours reading textbooks, watching videos, and conducting experiments just to understand the subject better. This was his moment to shine, to demonstrate how much he had absorbed. Yet, as his hand went up, he noticed Mrs. Harrison's hesitation. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. When she finally called on him, her words were laced with skepticism. "Yes, Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice colder than before. Alex felt the weight of her gaze upon him as he took a deep breath and spoke. The second law of thermodynamics states that in an isolated system, entropy, the measure of disorder, always increases over time. It means that energy transformations are never 100% efficient, and some energy is always lost as heat, making a perpetual motion machine impossible. There was a pause. Some of his classmates nodded, clearly impressed by the clarity of his explanation. For a moment, Alex thought he might actually be getting through. But then Mrs. Harrison's lips curled into a thin, almost mocking smile. "Well, that's an attempt," she said condescendingly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But perhaps someone else can explain it more effectively." "Anyone?" Alex's heart sank. He could feel the heat rise in his cheeks, a flush of embarrassment spreading across his face. His classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding his gaze, others glancing at him with pity. The sting of her words lingered in the air, suffocating him. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his answer had been correct, that he understood the subject deeply, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. and all he could do was lower his head and shrink further into his seat. Mrs. Harrison didn't stop there. She continued, her eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that felt more cutting than usual. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "perhaps you should focus on mastering the basics before trying to tackle advanced concepts. This is Ridgeview High, not an entry-level science camp." Her words were like a slap to the face. They hit him with the force of a punch, leaving him stunned and speechless. His hands clenched beneath the desk. But his mind was racing. He wanted to explain himself, to defend his integrity, but how could he, when the very person who was supposed to teach him had already dismissed him? The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. He could hear the muffled snickers from a few classmates, the discomfort in the air palpable. But Alex didn't have the strength to confront them, to fight back. He was lost in a sea of emotions, hurt, anger, and disbelief, and all he could do was sit there in silence, wishing the ground would swallow him up. What Alex didn't know, however, was that this moment of humiliation was being observed by someone who cared deeply about what was happening in that classroom. Principal Thompson had been alerted to Mrs. Harrison's behavior by several concerned students. A progressive leader who valued empathy and fairness. She decided to observe the class that day without announcing her presence. As she stood quietly at the back of the room, her eyes caught every detail of the exchange: Mrs. Harrison's dismissive attitude, Alex's quiet humiliation, and the discomfort that had settled over the class. What happened next would change everything for Alex, though he couldn't have known it at the time. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. But for Alex, it felt like nothing more than an escape from the suffocating atmosphere. He gathered his things slowly, still reeling from the experience. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in his chest. And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever truly belong at Ridgeview High. Little did he know, though, that this moment would be the catalyst for a change that would transform not only his experience but the whole school. And that change would come from an unexpected source, someone who, like Alex, understood the value of resilience and the importance of standing up for what is right. The next day, Alex came to class with a mix of determination and hesitation. He didn't know what to expect, but the events of the previous day still echoed in his mind. Mrs. Harrison's harsh words lingered, but so did the knowledge that he had been right. He had answered the question correctly, and his classmates had recognized it. Yet, the sting of her dismissal was something he couldn't easily shake off. As he entered the classroom, he could feel the unease in the air. Some of his classmates avoided eye contact, and others gave him sympathetic looks. But none of them said a word. It was as if they didn't know what to say or perhaps didn't want to make things worse. Mrs. Harrison was at the front of the class as usual, arms crossed, a stern expression on her face. Her gaze seemed colder today, more distant. Alex could feel the tension between them, the unsaid words hanging in the room. As he took his seat, he tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept wandering back to the previous day. Why had she treated him like that? What had he done wrong? Was it because he was different? He didn't have time to dwell on those questions for long because, just as the lesson began, the door opened. Alex looked up, startled, to see Principal Thompson walking into the room. Her presence immediately commanded attention, and a hush fell over the class. Mrs. Harrison's expression shifted from cool indifference to surprise, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison," Principal Thompson said evenly, her voice calm but carrying an underlying strength. "I'm here to observe today's class." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. Did she know what had happened yesterday? Had someone told her about Mrs. Harrison's behavior? He glanced around the room, but no one seemed to know what to make of the situation. All he could do was watch as Principal Thompson took a quiet position at the back of the classroom. Her eyes focused on the lesson. The class continued, but for Alex, everything felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that today, something was about to change. He tried to focus on the material, but the weight of Principal Thompson's presence hung heavily in the air. It wasn't long before the moment arrived that would mark the beginning of a new chapter. Mrs. Harrison began to discuss a new topic, and as she spoke, Her sharp eyes scanned the room. Alex sat quietly, still unsure of what to expect. Then, to his surprise, Mrs. Harrison turned her gaze toward him. She seemed almost hesitant, a flicker of discomfort passing over her face. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice colder than usual. "Could you help us with this next problem?" Alex's mind went blank. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that she was calling on him again after yesterday's humiliation, or the fear that he would be mocked once more for his efforts. But then, something shifted inside him. He had already been humiliated. What more could she do? With a deep breath, he raised his hand. "I'll give it a try," Alex said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He stood up slowly, walking to the board as the class watched. Their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. He could feel their gaze like a weight on his back. He faced the board and began to write the equation, explaining each step clearly, just as he had practiced in his mind. His explanation was methodical, concise, and, for the first time, he spoke with a confidence he hadn't felt before. "I believe the answer is..." Alex trailed off as he turned to the class, his gaze sweeping over them. The room was silent, save for the sound of his pen scratching against the board. As he finished his explanation, he turned to Mrs. Harrison. "Does that make sense?" There was a long pause. Mrs. Harrison's lips were pressed into a thin line, her face unreadable, but just as Alex began to brace himself for another round of criticism, Principal Thompson stood up and stepped forward, her calm presence immediately drawing everyone's attention. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice warm and firm, "that was an excellent explanation. Not only was your answer correct, but the way you articulated it was exceptional. It's clear that you've put in a great deal of effort to understand this material." Alex's eyes widened in disbelief. Had she really just said that? The words felt like a balm to the wounds left by Mrs. Harrison's earlier treatment. He could feel his classmates' eyes on him, but this time, they were filled with admiration rather than judgment. Mrs. Harrison's face remained tight, but she said nothing. "Mr. Reyes," Principal Thompson continued, "I would also like to take a moment to recognize you for your outstanding achievement in the National STEM competition. I've heard great things about your performance, and I believe we should all be proud of the hard work and dedication you've shown." The room erupted into applause. Alex stood there, stunned, as the noise washed over him. He looked around, seeing his classmates' faces shift from surprise to genuine respect. Even those who had snickered earlier now looked at him with new eyes. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for so long seemed to lift, replaced by something entirely different: respect. Mrs. Harrison's expression darkened, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Well, I wasn't aware of that," she said, her voice clipped. "Congratulations, Mr. Reyes." But it was clear to everyone in the room that her words lacked sincerity. Principal Thompson, however, wasn't finished. She turned to Mrs. Harrison, her gaze sharp. "I believe it's important that every student feels supported and valued in our classrooms," Principal Thompson said, her voice unwavering. "Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Harrison?" The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Harrison stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice unsteady. "Absolutely." As the bell rang and the class dismissed, several students approached Alex to congratulate him. Their silence from the day before was replaced by genuine warmth. One girl, Emma, even apologized. "I should have said something earlier," she said, her voice soft. "You didn't deserve that." Alex smiled, though the hurt still lingered. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It means a lot." But as he left the classroom, he felt a shift, a realization that he was not defined by that moment of humiliation. He had earned respect, not just for his academic abilities, but for his strength of character. And as the days passed, Alex would find that the story of his resilience would spread, sparking conversations about bias, empathy, and the importance of standing up for others. His journey was just beginning. As the weeks went by, Alex's experience at Ridgeview High became a turning point not just for him, but for the entire school. The incident with Mrs. Harrison, though painful, had sparked important conversations about bias, empathy, and the value of inclusivity. Principal Thompson's leadership and support had made a profound impact, not only in changing the way Alex was treated but also in encouraging other students to speak up against unfairness. Alex's confidence grew with every passing day. He no longer walked into that classroom with the weight of judgment on his shoulders. Instead, he carried with him the pride of knowing that he had earned respect. Not through perfection, but through resilience and courage. His classmates, once distant, now saw him for who he truly was, a bright, hard-working individual with a passion for learning. And for the first time since arriving at Ridgeview High, Alex truly felt like he belonged. In the end, it wasn't just Alex's academic achievements that defined him, but the strength of his character, the quiet determination that had carried him through every challenge. As the school year continued, Alex knew that his dream of becoming an engineer was no longer an abstract hope, but an achievable goal. Remember to subscribe to the channel to follow more life stories that inspire and uplift.